There are two really good comments in the chat that one came from Kayla and one came from Sarah. Do you guys want to unmute and share those? I think we could probably all relate to this. And I think the person who asked that question might relate well as well.
Yeah, just to my comment regarding power dynamics, I think, I don't know, that's like kind of where my mind went from that comment about not feeling like you get a different dynamic when there's a male voice in the room. Sometimes people, especially if they're like have that really like dominant personality or they have a really loud voice, like definitely a man with a loud voice comes different with a different energy than a woman with a loud voice, especially as a woman. And sometimes that can create a power dynamic. And sometimes it's just like there is a power dynamic because they're higher up on the food chain in the company or the situation, that your relationship with them, they have more authority than you, even if they're not like your boss. They're coming in with a request and you feel like because of that dynamic, you have to say yes. And then it's like really hard to push back. That was just kind of like where my mind went with that comment. And sometimes you can get that feeling with men, especially if they're like way above you on the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
And even though you can say no to them, it's really like that power dynamic's hard to overcome where you feel like you can't.
Yeah, I think for me, I've sat in boardrooms where I'm the only woman in the room. I've sat in boardrooms where I'm the only Black person in the room, and so, and I've been there, and everybody in the room, I was the only nurse, and everybody else were physicians, and so I already had that mental dynamic going on where I'm automatically answering to physicians, and what I found was that I had to gain their respect. And I'll never forget, we were sitting in a meeting one day, and the company was actually going to be acquired, and there was 14 different networks. And so they were going to take 14 different networks and bring it down to one. And that meant that each one of these networks had their own medical director, their own chief of operations, their own team and everything. And I remember being in the room, it was probably about 40 of us. And I remember saying, it's just like us being in college. I said, we all need to look to the left, look to the right, because one of you won't be here next year. And I didn't know that such a simple statement made a huge impact, because of course, these are physicians that are thinking, oh, well, I'm a physician, I'm going to be here. And lo and behold, many of those physicians are not. And I had so many of them to come back to me and said, Marci, I will never forget the statement that you made. And I'm sitting there like, well, what statement was it? Because, I just talk. And so they were like, you talked about how, you look to the left, look to the right, one won't be here. And, he was like, it made such an impact. And this was an older physician that was about to retire. And he says, but you were right. And I was like, yeah. And I won't forget that, because it took a lot for me to stand out and say something to a group of, majority of them were men. And the fact that they listened and they even came back to me later. And so I say that to say that sometimes you have to decide what battles you want to fight. You have to decide how you can demand and command respect of your peers, regardless of if they are male or female. But finding that, space within yourself, that confidence within yourself to be able to stand up and have your voice being heard.
That's great. Thank you. Sarah, do you want to unmute and share what your comment was?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I was just kind of thinking about the pressure that I felt in like my lived experience of feeling like I've had to say yes more often to not only like be considered as valuable in my role, but to also be provided opportunity. It seems like there can be quite a bit of, and this feels gendered to me, but just quite a bit of an assumption that a man will automatically take a role. So in order to feel like I can like advance to the point that I want to, or like I said, just be provided the same opportunity, there's like this added pressure behind like, yes, I will take that on. Yes, I will take that on. Yes, I will take that on. So yeah, I just was curious if anybody else had that similar experience.
It's funny, Sarah, because that's something that I posted about earlier, a little kind of related. And I think it's one of the hard things is, especially as women, there's a lot of advice in your career to take a step up and to volunteer for things and to take things on. And that often becomes a lot of volunteer activities within firms, whether that's leading a group or doing something here. And I think what can be challenging, and I don't have the answer, so I'm curious to hear from you guys, is where you find that distinction in that line between like putting yourself forward for things, leaning into things, trying to take on more work, and being the one who's always volunteering, the one who's always picking up the slack for other people, or the one who's always putting themselves forward for roles. And so I think especially as women, we get that advice of put yourself out there, take these reach projects, these stretch projects, but then it goes like, you're saying yes to everything, and you can't. If you're saying yes to all the other stuff, then you don't have the bandwidth to take on that reach project or that stretch project because you pick up these 6 other things over here. And so knowing where that line is, I think it's really, really hard. And that was something I posted earlier. Marci, as I think about that zone of genius and having been in a managerial role many times in finance, it's really hard because I do want to, especially when I had a team my last role, I had a team of 30 under me, and I wanted to encourage all of them to do things. But that zone of genius thing is a great line. And it can also be really hard as a manager because you want to keep people in their zone of genius so that they're excelling, and knowing when to push them and when's the right time to stretch that zone of genius and grow that zone of genius, but also when the right time to let them shine is. I think it's really hard. And so I would welcome any thoughts on that. That was a lot, but just to say, Sarah, I agree with you. And those are the things that I think about with what you said.
I think the biggest thing is self-awareness. Now, it's one thing to stretch and move outside your comfort zone and volunteer for things. And I encourage everybody to do that. But you do it at your own pace. You do it, as you feel led and guided and directed to do it. It's, people coming to you and asking you to do things, and you're being mindful of what you already have on your plate. You have to ask yourself, do I really have the bandwidth to add one more thing onto my plate and do a really good job at it as well? When the time when my sister died, it was really hard for me because my sister stayed in ICU for 53 days. And she went in unexpected. My sister was having a plate sale on a Friday, and by the following Wednesday, she was in the hospital on a ventilator. And the company was going through an acquisition. And I was leading the acquisition. My medical director was not involved. The majority of the people within the company were in my department. And I knew that I could not be heading up an acquisition and be at the hospital trying to take care of my sister who was on a vent. I could not be in both places. And I had to make a decision. And it was very hard because Marci was known to be a person that could get stuff done. She was a peacemaker. She could bring both sides together and come to a happy medium, but I could not do both. And I knew that once I stepped back and said I couldn't do it, I would never really be able to put my foot back in it because I don't like being behind. If I started a project, I wanted to be ahead and know exactly all the different moving parts. And once I stepped away to take care of my sister and be there, I could not move back. I couldn't move into that role. And it was very hard, but I knew within myself that it was something that I had to do for me. And if I tried to do both, I would not do a good job with the acquisition because my mind would be at the hospital with my sister. And I had to have a talk with my medical director, and he was completely understanding. And so when you want to stretch and do more projects, when you want to stretch and grow, there's nothing wrong with that. I encourage everybody, if you feel led, comfort zones can get stale, stagnant, dirty, stinking. So get out of your comfort zones. I encourage everybody, move out of your comfort zones. Try something new. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything that's work related. It can be something at home, but try to move out of your comfort zones if you feel led to do it. But just know everything that you're juggling. You cannot continue to add more and more and more and more, and expect that everything is going to come out hunky-dory, because usually something suffers. And if it's not the project itself that you're, stretching, it's your health.